I'm delighted to welcome Maurice Jones, the CEO of OneTen and the former CEO of LISC, one of the largest CDFIs in the United States. Maurice, welcome. A lot's happened in the last couple of years since we interviewed you for the CDFI Leaders Series. And as you know, we're revisiting and talking to a few of the same folks. And you're one that very graciously accepted our invitation to do that. So what I wanted to do was just to start with your reflections on the last 15 months or so in particular, the pandemic, George Floyd's murder, the heightened awareness of systemic racism, and the willingness of some people to step up and say, okay, we now need to really deal with the issues that we have in this country. And I'm particularly interested from your point of view because you have the very interesting perspective of having changed roles during the pandemic from the CDFI space, so from LISC, to your new organization, OneTen. And I think it would be very interesting for people to hear your point of view, both on the last 15 months, but also on your own transition from running one of the largest community development finance institutions to building what is in effect a new organization funded by corporates.
Yeah. Well, Tim, nice to nice to chat with you again. Look, I think the last 15 months or so, if I reflect on it, I think a number of sort of things run through my mind, right? The pandemic, which we're still battling, the recession, which we're battling out of or rebounding from, but we're still in rebound. The killings that really, I think, seared the American soul, killings like those of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd in particular, the racial reckoning that was in part unleashed at a new level of intensity because of these things, but has always been there. The national elections and what the elections brought out in terms of the polarization of the country. All of these things, I think, have actually created more visibility with respect to the disparities in the country than we had before this stuff. And what I mean by that is, I believe now that some of the disparities in wealth, in health, in opportunity that are largely about race and place in the country are more visible to more people. That creates an incredible opportunity that we have as a country to once again attempt to live into the creed of catalyzing opportunity and equity for everybody. And I think that's what you see going on a lot now, right? OneTen, the company that I'm a part of now, really was birthed because of this new visibility, new recognition, renewed recognition of the work still to be done in the country to form a more perfect union. Some of the incredible one-time or first-time investments in community development from organizations in retail and philanthropic organizations and tech companies that had not been making these kinds of investments before, or at least not even close to the levels that they are making them now. These things all represent a new recognition of the work to be done, a making visible barriers and injustices that for a lot of people were invisible before, and now they are acting on that. So I think it's been painful. It's been heartbreaking. It's been in many ways, just sorrowful 15 months. And it has been 15 months that I think have given us a new opportunity as a country to become what the vision for this country, I believe, is continuing to be forged as, one in which you can start anywhere and be president, or you can start anywhere and be CEO. That newfound desire to make that a reality is also what has come out of these 15 months. And it is because of that I transitioned from LISC, where I was having a really, really exciting and fun time, to a new opportunity where you've got now 53 companies who have come together and have committed to hiring and advancing explicitly Black talent without 4-year degrees, and hiring and promoting them into family-sustaining careers. This kind of coalition has never come together for this explicit objective, bold and ambitious like this, in my lifetime, which I think leads me to maybe the last reflection for me on this period or these 15 months. Now, and I tell people this all the time, now is not the time to play small ball, to use a sports analogy. But now really is the time, coming in the wake of these events of the last 15 months. And now with this newfound, I believe, commitment to, and I think it's genuine, to actually making us a more perfect union, now is the time for us to be going big, aspiring big, investing big, putting together big coalitions, tackling big problems. And that's really what appealed to me about OneTen. Is it's a big, bold ambition. And my view is now is the time to try to make that a reality. So a long-winded sort of stream of reflections, but you mentioned it, the stepping up. I'm seeing the stepping up all over the place. I'm seeing it now at the federal level and in the public sector. I'm seeing it across the country in companies. I'm seeing philanthropic organizations stepping up. I'm seeing CDFIs and other nonprofits. And I think that is exactly right. The real key for us is how you transform this moment into a movement. And part of transformation into a movement is having big, bold ambitions.
So Maurice, that's fantastic summary or reflection, series of reflections, as you said. I mean, one of the things, there are a couple of things that were contained in there that are strings that I want to pull on and ask you about. So, what's different this time? I mean, why are you so confident? And confident perhaps is the wrong word, but optimistic that this time America, which has always been built on that promise, but hasn't actually lived it, as you rightly pointed out, in terms of inequities, systemic racism, whatever you want to describe. What is different this time, and why do you think that we will sustain it? Because often, when something happens, like the killings, as you rightly referred to in terms of society in particular, but also the pandemic, is that people go back to normal and they kind of say, well, it's not really that important. I need to focus on what I need to focus on. So I'm very curious to hear what you're seeing that is different this time.
Yeah, I think one of the components that is different this time is the commitments that we're seeing from the private sector to actually fight explicitly for racial justice, for a more perfect union, and their willingness to put resources on the table and make commitments to resources, and their willingness to actually be self-critical of themselves and commit to changing themselves as well. I think that piece of it, for me, makes this a little different from what you usually see. This is not just a moment in which government or social movements are stepping up. In both cases, there are. But this is also a moment when some of the leading entities stepping up to attempt to bring about change are the private sector, folks who used to be so worried about the risk that they would tick off a shareholder or a board member that they were going to just stay quiet on these things. Don't get me wrong, there's still a lot more work to do in that space to energize even more of this kind of action or bias for action for social, quote unquote, social reasons in the private sector. But this is the strongest and the most activity I've seen from the private sector saying, we're going to step in and lead, and we will do it at the cost, frankly, of investors, or losing investors, or at the cost of making some of our shareholders or investors unhappy with us. That, for me, is one of the changes. The other change that I guess makes me encouraged about this moment is, in fact, the kinds of focus on first causes, on systemic issues, on things that are more than just, okay, I'm going to make a donation here or a philanthropic gift here. You know, the kinds of things that this coalition at OneTen committed to doing, which is, hiring folks without 4-year degrees and literally removing the 4-year degree as a barrier to access to these family sustaining careers. I mean, this is the deep stuff that is going to require a long time in order to actually fulfill the ambition. So I think, that combination of this incredible private sector activism and this focus on solving things that cannot be solved through a transaction, that will have to be solved through years of hard work, give me encouragement. Now, let me just, to your point, let me just say, I'm a naive optimist, so I'm going to plead guilty to that. But I also know that the risk of this just being a moment is high. And so the other piece for me that is quite encouraging is to see the way that, in particular, the employees of these companies are saying to these companies, you want me? You want to retain me? You want to keep me feeling like I'm in the right place? Then you better stay at this long enough to make a difference. And I think that could be the secret sauce behind all of this. This for a lot of these private sector actors, this is a matter of talent, recruitment, and retention, and the pressure that they're feeling from employees to actually walk the walk here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I remember back in our conversation, which ironically we weren't doing on Zoom, we did as a telephone call, is that one of the things that you mentioned was corporate specifically. And in 2018, there were no corporate funders in the CDFI community development market in general. And I remember you had just actually won the RFP, and I remember you telling the story about how that came about. It was an RFP, and you responded to it, and you appropriately called the business for Facebook in East Palo Alto, as I recall. And that was quite extraordinary foresight. So it's interesting to me that you've gone to OneTen, and I agree with you that bold moves, ambitious moves are really necessary, and courage, I think. And so I'm encouraged by the fact that you believe that the movement that you're creating, or at least the commitment that you have from the coalition, will actually be a much longer term thing. I think that the other thing on the multi-stakeholders, what I think of as multiple stakeholders, is I agree with you that there is a move toward that, but I think it's still very early days. And
I think you're right.
Right, and I hope that they begin to think about, and investors, asset owners in particular, begin to think about their investments beyond ESG. So looking at the non-financial capitals, because ESG is still, as you know very well, basically a financial rate of return, a risk-adjusted rate of return. Whereas if you factor in environmental, human, and civic as well, it begins to have a different set of connotations. So, I think that's another strong development, that you talked about. I'm curious as to, how you reflect upon, the community development, not specifically necessarily the CDFIs, but the community development industry, and whether you think that, or what you think they're going to need to do to really, be able to help the corporate sector to understand, what is required, what is needed, or do you think that there are other organizations, other types of entities, other nonprofit social organizations, for example, that are going to play the biggest role in terms of acting as an intermediary for corporates as they think about the communities that they want to support and that they want to help?
So I think the answer is the community development industry and the community development financial institution industry will still play pivotal roles in partnering with the corporate sector in engaging in transformative work. And a big piece of why that is the case is because the community development world has relationships in the places with the people and the organizations that we must participate, that we must act in and with, in order to actually do a lot of this work. And the community development world has credibility, street cred, and intelligence and relationships, and frankly, expertise and competency in working in these areas, and doing so in a way that both affects positive change and, frankly, protects one's investments. And so I don't think that the corporate sector will be able to, or it won't even be smart to try to bypass that community development infrastructure, because that infrastructure knows these communities better than any other. They've been working in it for 2 generations and more. I do think there are other organizations that will be partners with the community development entities. You know, a lot of what we're seeing now is sort of the merging of or inclusion of a number of spaces under the community development umbrella that have heretofore been outside of that umbrella. You can't fight climate change and not have a community development strategy. You can't be in the business of resilience to disasters or to climate change and not be in the business of community development. And so my sense is that there's just a merging. You can't be in the health business, right? You can't make people healthy unless you're about the social determinants of health. So I think what you're seeing is just a collapsing of what have historically been considered separate spaces into what has to have at its core community development. And so what that presents is just these new opportunities for collaboration and scale at this work that we haven't had up to now. You know, you can't, when it is so obvious to people that 80% of one's health status, 80% of the determinants of one's life expectancy actually is what goes on outside of the clinical setting, right? Whether you have access to food that's healthy and housing that's quality and affordable, jobs that pay living wages. The more people understand that, the more they know that if I'm claiming I'm in the health space, I got to be in the community development space. Unless all I care about is sick care, I got to be in the community development space. So that's why I think that community development is more and more important as a partner for the big issues that we have to fight and face in this country than it has ever been.
What do you think that's going to imply in terms of change from the point of view of, you know, I hear consistently that there's a lot of capital that wants to work in communities, but they can't find how to channel that in a way, to use your word, that allows some element of scale, right? So how do we change the imagination to think that, you know, it doesn't just have to be housing or federally qualified health centers or charter schools. It can be, or small business. It can be a lot more than that. So I think your point's right, holistic, but how do we spark the or challenge, you know, the industry to think differently and not just as lenders, for example?
So it is, I think, the one of the great imperatives of the industry. The industry itself has to change its self-concept. The notion that I'm a pure community development lender is a very limited and a self-inflicted wound, and ultimately is not what the people that we're trying to be of service to needs. And so we as an industry have to be willing to be transformed by the needs of the people we're trying to serve. The people we're trying to serve need us to be more than lenders. They need us to be in the business of holistically helping them to transform their lives and their communities and the trajectory of both the individuals and the community. That requires capital, that requires health, that requires jobs. They need us to use the positions and the leverage and the relationships and the knowledge that we have to try to bring all of that. So I think you've hit on one of the key pieces for the industry to be thinking about moving forward, which is I look forward to the day when we're not using the nomenclature CDFI, because we need to be more than CDFIs for the folks that we're trying to serve.
Maurice, your insights are very helpful. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to take us out to wrap here. Perhaps by, you have a very unique background, having been in government, having run one of the largest CDFIs, and now having moved to lead a coalition of the largest corporates in America. So I'm curious as to what your message is to the community and economic development space in general. Your optimism is I can feel it through the Zoom.
Or my naivete, right?
It's not naivety. You've got so much experience that it's not based on naivety. So how would you lead us? Take us out here.
I would lead us with this. Look at what's happening in the country. We've got a racial wealth gap of about 10 times, right? Well, white families have 10 times more median wealth than Black families. We've got literally in the same city, Washington, D.C. or whatever, you can drive 10 miles to the east and be in a census tract where the life expectancy is 63, and 10 miles to the west, life expectancy is 83, and the individuals could be born at the same hospital. And what's different are the climates that they're in, right? We've got a situation where you have 1 in 3 Black men expected to be justice involved during their lifetime. I think that same data point for white men is 1 in 17. We have to close these gaps. These gaps are the greatest risk to the American experiment. Now is the time to be forging the relationships that we can to dive into these gaps, to really, really holistically close the racial wealth, health, and opportunity gaps. And we have never had a more promising time in my lifetime than now, because the lids that closed a lot of eyes to these gaps, or that were denials of these gaps, have been opened wider than they've ever been before. There's still some opening to be done, but they have been opened wider than they've ever been before. Let's take this moment and let's go big, and let's forge partnerships that heretofore we didn't dream of. And I look forward to being a part of it.
Maurice Jones, thank you very much, and for the inspiration. And the
Tim, nice to be with you. Nice to be with you, my friend. You stay well.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care.